Hey, how's it going, Robin and Lisa? Thanks so much for facilitating this for the startup community here back in Australia as well. I think on behalf of Equal Experts Australia and New Zealand, we're just as excited to start getting sort of that community spirit back and getting innovation-minded people in a room and seeing what we can come up with. I know in front of me in the room we've got a couple of founders doing incredible things, some in the crypto space, some in the social well-being space. So I think, yeah, there's definitely going to be a lot of benefit from this talk.
Oh, well, I thank you. We're really happy to be here. So welcome everyone. And, I know we were expecting Dave Brown and he really extends his apologies, but he will be here next week. Looking forward to it. Same time, I believe same channel, which could be on site and Zoom, because now I just can't say same channel with confidence as I see everyone sitting face to face. Congratulations to you all. It's kind of so refreshing to see. And, I was thinking from 2020 and COVID, and something that's near and dear to me. I've been talking to a lot of organizations last year about pivoting with purpose. We kind of had to do it today for this talk. And one of the reasons why I thought Robin could be a good person to chat about is because from 2019 and 2020, he's a founder of not one, but two companies. So he'll talk a little bit about kind of his past, just so you kind of get a flavor of the skills. And also it's interesting, from the first company in 2019, CoperAce, that's on his LinkedIn, it was all about the in-store experience and the connecting kind of the digital to the in-store experience. And then as COVID came along and all the stores shut down, we kind of will hold your breath about how that story went, but there's some interesting things there. And then kind of talking into what is the next gig and in that journey. And hopefully then we can have lots of questions and an open forum about what you guys are experiencing from startups as well. So Robin, welcome. We're really glad to have you join us, and we'll set the stage by kind of tell us about your journey to date. How did you get to being in this co-founder of not one, but two startups?
Cool. Thanks, and hello everyone that's out there. I guess for all intents and purposes, I'm the substitute teacher for today. So we'll do our best to keep you entertained and on track. So no misbehaving, as it were. But in any event, so I've had a very circuitous route in terms of my career. Believe it or not, the first half of my career was spent in the luxury fashion apparel industry. It sounds crazy when I say that to people now, but I literally started off my career working for Ralph Lauren, 8 years. And at one point, just to give you a sense of like the variety of things that I've done in that capacity, everything from running stores to, I actually started off selling suits for them, believe it or not. But by the time I was 22, I was their buyer for home furnishings. So imagine a 22-year-old in New York that knew everything about Waterford Wedgwood crystal and 18/8 stainless steel and bedding products. And my friends were like, what the hell is it you do? So it was not your typical journey. From there, I was part of the original team that built the Nautica brand back in the mid-90s. It sounds really, I feel old every time I say that. I think Nautica is still a brand. I'm not sure if it's around. It's certainly not in the US anymore. But that was my career path. It was retail, it was fashion, it was Nautica, Donna Karan, London Fog for a brief stint. I've always had a interest in the technology side of business and how it was applied. So I completely jumped ship along the way and went to work for a tech startup. It was just, I was bored and I wanted to do something different. And it was focused in the retail space, and just jumped full on. And that was kind of when the .com bubble burst. So that was an interesting ride. But a couple years in, that company was acquired by an analytics firm called SAS Institute. So for the next 12 years, I became an expert in data science and analytics and how to apply that in business, and literally traveled around the world, the last 5 of which I basically was assigned to Canada and Latin America. And so I built their businesses in those countries. And then along the way a company came knocking called Thoughtworks, which is a software development firm focused on Agile. I didn't know anything about Agile or software development, but I jumped in there as their vice president of their first business unit. They were trying to go to a vertical strategy. And so I learned everything about Agile and lean development, continuous delivery, the whole bit, design sprints. And then another company came knocking on the door. This time it was an agency out of Brooklyn, New York called Huge. And that was really interesting. I finally got to piece together kind of everything that I had done up till that point into a management consulting type of umbrella. Left that, decided I had enough of New York, and started my own consulting, CoperAce. And the catalyst for that was what I was learning along the way with all these companies. And I won't get into too much of what it is, other than to say there was a light bulb for me when I started on the management consulting side and realized, as an example, I had one client who had spent about $3 million on with Bain Consulting. And 3 months after that project wrapped up, they brought me in with my team, and I was like, you just spent $3 million. Why am I here? And the response from their CEO was, well, we got some really interesting, information, but we really don't know what to do with it. Like, it wasn't operational. They couldn't, execute inside their company. And so I decided to take a very different approach, and I basically, I was like, how do I take Agile from a software development perspective and kind of extrapolate that up and across the enterprise? And how do I get the enterprise thinking differently about innovation and continuous delivery? So not just in the province of IT, but across these different disciplines and functions. And it worked. And I did it again, and it worked. And all of a sudden I was like, holy shit, there's something here. And so after it worked a number of times, I decided, like, well, hell, I can do this for myself. So that was really the catalyst to go and do this for myself with a focus in the retail space. So I set up shop, and then a couple of months later, COVID hit. And guess what? Everyone was retrenching, retooling. Accidentally, I ended up doing a lot of work with private equity firms who were, looking at acquiring companies and wanting to think through not just the traditional, how do I understand the marketplace, competitors, blah, 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 but how do I look at this business different? So I took that same learning and drove that into kind of an analysis that I used with PE firms. So long story short, that was kind of where I started 2019 with retail, ended up pivoting to private equity work. And then along the way, as with most people in the kind of COVID era, so to speak, I started thinking about, what do I really want to do? Because as I looked around and I saw a lot of my friends and colleagues, their life was being upended. Some people were furloughed, some people were just laid off completely, entire industries were just tanking. Certainly, as I looked at, what was going on in the retail space, it was hit or miss, depending on the segment that you were in. If you were in grocery, if you were a big box retailer, you were doing great. If not, apparel, other segments were just tanking. So I decided, like, wow, this is a great opportunity to really think about the things that I've wanted to do in my life. And I know this is getting a little broad-based here. So it wasn't a midlife crisis, although I do think that once in a while in terms of rethinking what I'm doing. But it actually was a great time to do something different. And so in addition to the consulting business, I started a tech startup, which is actually where I started working more with Dave Brown, who was the speaker that was scheduled for this evening. I had worked with him on another project, and once I started this other company, it's actually called A-Space. I brought him on board as an advisor. Just because of his experience, he's been a great resource to talk to about how to think through startup and kind of what to expect from investors and valuations and all those types of things. So that's been like a weird journey when I think about it. I was actually telling the story about a month ago when I was in college or university. I actually thought I was going to have a career with IBM because I worked with IBM at university, and I realized one day when I showed up, it was a Saturday, I showed up to my boss's birthday party, and everybody was wearing a white or blue button-down Oxford, khaki pants, and like loafers, and I showed up, head to toe, Ralph Lauren, thought I was looking really fly, and looked completely out of place. So I decided right then and there, IBM was not going to be the thing for me. But that's a long story of kind of how I got to where I am today. Lisa, I'm not hearing.
Yeah, that's very. Thank you for that. I know we did a lot of walkabouts last year, so I have kind of the insider scoop around talking through how do you make that leap from, I think that this is a really good idea, I think that there's a need in the market, to going through, I believe today we have A-Space, there's patent pending, there's lawyers involved, there's investors involved, there's all sorts of getting to that critical mass where it's gaining momentum. You're feeling like, oh, it's becoming a reality, starting to tease out the MVP. So from that early, think back a lot, like from last year, how did you make the transition from I have this idea to really putting in all that effort to get to what needs to be done?
Sure. I'll focus on A-Space for that point, because the CoperAce, my consulting business, was more straightforward. It's more about a network of folks and getting clients, and it's more human capital, so to speak. With regards to A-Space, it's, being an entrepreneur can be very lonely and scary and depressing in the beginning. Not that I'm trying to scare anyone off, but it starts with that idea. You've got to have that, fire in your belly, so to speak, to really believe in that idea. In my case, it's something that I've noodled on for about 10 to 15 years. I actually tried to get two of the companies that I work for to, bite on it, so to speak, but it wasn't aligned with their business model. So it started with, understanding the market and the timing for your business idea. And it's interesting, when I started this, all the signals were there. So last year, as I kind of surveyed the market, the signals were there saying that this has viability. So that's one of the first things that you need to assess, because you can have the greatest idea. There could be utility to it, but if the market's not ready and it's not viable at that moment, then it really doesn't matter, because you're not going to get the traction that you need. So I could see the viability as I kind of surveyed the market, looked at the competitive landscape, and what's happened now over time is the market is evolving much faster. So I've been getting excited over time to see that, because the message and where I'm going, it's all starting to converge and coalesce. So in the beginning, in terms of the journey, and I'm sure, with some of the entrepreneurs in your audience, they've gone through the same thing. It's a lot of internal research and validation, first validation with friends and your kind of close network. From there, certainly in the US, and just knowing the competitive landscape, it was, how do I quickly start to kind of get enough meat around this so that I can protect the IP? So that was a big part of the process of, filing a patent, because that takes time depending on what it is that you're trying to build and develop. So certainly there was that element. of kind of filing a patent while I continue to refine it. So it starts with your inner circle of friends to say like, hey, am I crazy? Do you think this will work or this is valid? And for the most part, it's people you know, people that know you. And, you know, most people are, you know, if the idea is sound, they will kind of validate, you know, what you want to hear, so to speak. But it's important to move outside of that inner circle. And that's really where someone like Dave has been invaluable, especially Dave, because he is an investor. He does work with a lot of startups. And as you know, my first phone call, so just to set the stage for the audience, for the first probably 3 months, I spoke to maybe 10 people in my inner circle. Everyone loved the idea. I thought it was great, blah, blah, blah. I spent 2 hours on the phone with Dave.
I think they even said something, Robin, too, that they would, you know, spend money and sign up. Like, where do I sign? Right? It was just, yeah.
No, it was great. I had the CTO of one Walmart company say like, you know, this is fantastic. I'll be an angel investor, and you just hear that, and you're just like, hey, this is fabulous. And then I got on the phone with Dave, and I said, Dave, I need your eyes on this. Give me your thoughts. And halfway through that conversation, it was a 2-hour conversation. Halfway through it, I basically said to him, okay, I feel like I really don't know shit after talking to you, because he just came at it from a very different perspective. He's looking at it from a lens of why would I give you, a couple $100,000 or $500,000, or why would any investor spend time to do this? And so it was an education, because it wasn't, and you've got to be able to take feedback well. You've got to be able to, kind of stand with your conviction, because there were moments when you hear things and you have to temper that with, okay, I hear what he's saying. I need to understand where he's coming from, and others. So it wasn't just Dave, and kind of compartmentalize that, but also know in my gut, like my experience tells me, in terms of like industry expertise, like this, there's something to this. So it's about taking that feedback, and incorporating it in. And it's important to get a broad perspective. So I had, feedback from Dave, who is an investor by profession. I reached out to another person. This guy was the former CEO of Unilever and also Nestle at one point in his career. And he's taken public companies public, and started his own company. So that was important. I've even reached out to Ryan and some folks at Equal Experts to say, like, here's what I'm trying to do, like, architecturally, from a strategy perspective, what do you guys think? Because at first you don't have a startup team, and that's what's important. You really need to kind of leverage an extended network until you can get either a technical co-founder or developers on board. In my case, because it's a technology startup. So it's the network is important to have when you're starting off. I don't want to ramble on, but it's.
I think that's the power of the network. It's something that Equal Experts is that's our mission statement. Our value is that once you're in our kind of network, it just grows and exponentially. You never know who you're connected to that can help you. Were you surprised in kind of this day and age where we're even extending beyond kind of digital platforms into really digital ecosystems, really extending out one step further? Were you surprised about the power of your network and who was really stepping up and really supporting you in this initiative?
Yes and no. So yes, because some people, will bought into the idea and the vision much more than you anticipate in some cases. And there are those who want to, it's their nature to help and jump in kind of with both feet, so to speak. The interesting observation I'll make is that everyone was encouraging to the extent that I think what I'm seeing more broadly with COVID is that there is license to really do something different. And so many people that I, over the years of having a professional career, they followed the path, and, they've gone through an organization, they rise in that organization, they take on different roles and responsibilities, much the same way that I did. And, I had made that decision, a year earlier to say, look, I want to do something different. I think I can apply my skills for my own benefit versus a company. But what I've been finding over the past, 12, 18 months is that there's two sides to that equation. One, more and more people are completely making a switch in terms of what they're doing. They are changing careers, changing industries. They're rethinking, and it's not just a midlife crisis, so to speak. It is a taking stock of, is this what I want to do with the rest of my life? And on the flip side, I've seen it from companies and even recruiters that have reached out to me over the past 6 months. Companies they have a different lens now. They expect that people are making different changes, different choices. So it's no longer, hey, I need to see that you have a pedigree in this particular industry or space. And not all, but there's a growing number that are looking out there for talent and saying, interesting, I'm looking at overall capabilities, aptitude, attitude, and that's more important to me as a company in thinking about innovation, thinking about where do we go next strategically versus the same old, same old. And I think it's a result of people having to rethink everything, whether it's about business, whether it's how they work, where they work, all those types of things. So that's been interesting that people along the way have been very supportive of the idea of like, wow, you're doing a startup and it's something different, and very accepting in their level of involvement. People are, I've had people say like, how do I get involved? Like, I'd love to try and do something different as well.
So when you had kind of talked about your time at Huge and investing with confidence when you had millions of dollars, what are some of the things that you learned when you have not millions of dollars and it could be a retirement fund to kick off this startup? That same kind of what are prioritizations, so to speak, of where those dollars go?
Yeah, I'll start by just talking about what I see in the startup community as a whole. Just given the fact that you have a startup community there, I believe. It's no longer, I think the de facto standard, or most people, thinking when they hear startup, it's, it's a couple 20-something-year-olds, it's, they're out in San Francisco or maybe Colorado or whatever it is, and it's a Silicon Valley play. And it's been interesting over the past 12, 18 months, the diversity that I've seen in that space. First of all, geographical diversity. So I've certainly plugged into the startup communities, where I live. But just seeing these ecosystems well beyond, San Francisco, extending to various cities along the East Coast, so to speak, and in terms of founders. So it's no longer just the young 20-something-year-olds. It's a lot of women. There's more minorities. There are specific investment funds and VC firms catering to those groups in particular. It's amazing to me the number of VC funds that I see popping up, over time, that are catering specifically, even some people in my own network that have been involved in that. So that's one distinction of note. Lisa, remind me where the question is. I think I just lost my thought.
No, so it was about kind of how are you placing your bets with a limited amount of money, showing that real utility of business value to kind of get a Dave or someone like him to say, hey, let's scale it.
Yeah, it's certainly been educational because I'm on a different side of that equation. So in my prior life, so in the last kind of corporate job that I had at Huge, where I ran the consulting business, we would, I would be advising companies on, how do you think about innovation and MVP products and where to start? And now that I'm doing the same thing for myself, it's really interesting because it's not as pure as I thought it would be, is my expectation going into it. So, for those of you who are following that kind of agile or MVP type approach, it's like, what's that minimal thing that I can prove out and then iterate and then, keep going? And yes, you need to do that, but there's also this other side that you need to balance with, how much do you need to prove out in the beginning in order to get investment dollars? And how much do you need to prove out in the beginning to kind of help drive a valuation in order to get investment dollars? So all of these different things just created a different calculus. And you picked up on a phrase that I use, which is, I use that in my consulting work, because it's one of the things that I help executives do, is how do you invest capital with confidence? And I find myself kind of applying the same theory and logic to, okay, if you have a finite amount and it's not, a corporate capital budget of, $3 million, or a project that I'm used to working with on the other side, it's a much smaller amount to say, like, all right, we need to be scrappy. It's hard. You've got to make some trade-offs in terms of, the resources that you bring to bear, what will go into that MVP product, and what are you willing to, how much skin are you willing to put in the game? So you've really got to, you've got to believe in it and do your research to back it up. So it's very different. The other comment I'll make to that is on the other side to that. So right now, just the nature of the product that I'm trying to build, our MVP, I'm trying to find a co-development partner in the form of a retailer. So because that's the industry we're going to start with first, is the retail sector. And it's interesting because now I'm having the same conversation with the retail executives of these potential partners to say, just the nature of the product, like, hey, if you partner with us, here are the benefits that you will get. And at the end of the day, it actually helps you invest capital with confidence across your various, operational, functions. So whether it's merchandising, marketing, et cetera, those types of things. So you've got to be laser focused. You really do. Having said that, the cash is out there. So my advice to anyone who is, thinking about going into the space, into a startup, or if you have an idea, obviously make sure that, there's a good strategy and it's strategically sound, and, there's a market for it and all of those types of things. You've got to have the sound business fundamentals behind your idea, but the opportunity is there. So the barrier is no longer capital and cash. I mean, cash is flowing. So there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just last week. In Q1 of this year, investors have put $69 billion into startups in the first 3 months of 2021. So that's a 41% increase over the last high, which was like 2018, Q4 of 2018. So it's, if you've got a good idea, there are plenty of people out there with cash that are looking for places to invest. And as I said, you can see it, just the number of startups that are specializing in either niche sectors, niche types of founders, diverse products. So that's not even my worry. Quite honestly, it's really aligning the right resources and speed to market. The cash thing is going to happen if you've got, a good business idea.
And to kind of wrap up, we'll go really high again. Well, not that high, but no, we'll go really high. In COVID has kind of been a level set for a lot of people who were like disconnected into like the tech world, right? We have seniors going on Zoom and TikTok and Clubhouse, like some of these new startups that are just kind of raging in the environment, and more people are now seeing the importance of having some sort of digital profile. Does that lend itself to a consolidation in the market, or just being open for all these new ideas from like tech startups and more apps? Like, what's your gut tell you?
In terms of, is that like where's innovation happening, or?
Well, it's more of, we now have a larger population. I think of our neighbor who's like now, on Zoom or doing things that, where before it was like, yes, I want a paper binder. I'm never, ever, ever putting anything in a digital format. And
Right.
what COVID and the stay at home has done was really force a lot of behaviors to say, you have to learn some of these things. So that learning has happened across the board, even where there were resistors. So I guess the question is, does that give more opportunity to kind of all of these startups to hit a larger market, or are these some like ancillary markets that will always have their needs unmet because no one's kind of looking at them? Like, what is your feeling on that?
Yeah. So I think broadly speaking, there's definitely a growing awareness from a broader segment of the population in terms of the role that technology can play in their lives. So your example about people being on Zoom that never really did Zoom before is probably a good one. And I think probably the biggest thing fueling that is the relationship between employers and employees, and the nature of work, and the definition of like, where do you go to work? And so, last year, I had a weekly, I'd almost call it a therapy session. So a colleague of mine, we had a weekly call with about 20 different retail executives. And so it was everything from, the CIO of the vitamin shop to the CIO of Sephora. So it was just a cross section of, retailers across the US. And it was interesting. I had one of those companies basically say, we had a job posting for some analyst in New Jersey, and they completely redefined it. And they said, like, at this point, we don't care where they live. They could be in Oklahoma. So they just completely rethought that. And so we've seen yes, that speaks more broadly to the work from home movement. But what's happening now is, there's this kind of awakening on both sides with employers and employees saying, well, wait a minute. I've got the friend of mine who's the CMO of Hearst Publications is, talking to him, and he's looking at their business and saying, okay, does it make sense for us to go back in? For the most part, some of us can do our jobs, we don't have to be in the office. And then I have other friends who are telling me how like annoyed they are because they're being forced to go into the office, and they're on a Zoom call and they can see the people, 2 cubicles away that they're on the Zoom call with, and they're saying, why the hell am I here? So without going into all of that, yes, it kind of, so I think a lot of innovation will come from that in terms of bridging this gap as companies figure out what is that right balance. So there will be new tools, new processes, all of those types of things. And I think the population as a whole is more accepting of new and different technologies. And I'll draw that back to my comment earlier with the fact that more and more people are just kind of reinventing themselves, and deciding to go a new direction in their career, whether they even continue with a professional career or not. And so I think it's like, I don't want to say a wild, wild west, but people are much more open to trying different things, especially technology. And it's crazy. I mean, things like Clubhouse with $1 billion valuation, it's, I think those are outliers. But in general, I think we'll see a lot of more emergent technologies that will, have very high rates of adoption. You know, if you think of the curve historically, that is ramping up at a faster pace.
Great. Well, I think that kind of wraps up this portion. We'd love to take some questions if there are any, or observations.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a question I've got around the funding side. You talked a lot about the multi-billion dollars of funding going into startups, but how much of that is actually just limited to the US? Given that we've got quite an Australian market here, I think we see nowhere near that level of investment. So how could people here maybe tap into that or show those ideas? Are investors willing to cross borders and invest in startups not outside of the US?
I didn't hear all that, so let me see if I can paraphrase. Was it was it that $69 billion? Was it all US?
Yeah, is it all in US, and are they willing to invest outside of the US?
Yeah, so yeah, that $69 billion number is specific to the US. So that is just the US, which is huge. And so generally speaking, the US market is going to have a much bigger population of startups and investment dollars to begin with. A lot of the investment. So having said that, I think your follow-on question is apropos, so to speak, because it's not, the startups are not all US driven. So, you know, I can't tell you, for example, the number of startups that I've encountered just in my professional world at my last company that were just from Israel, as an example. But we're being funded in the US. We're doing pilots with US companies. So I think the dollars are open to, you know, anyone with a good idea. So, you know, be it Australia or anywhere in the world. It was interesting, even, oh my goodness, I was trying to think of, there was is it Jack Ma, like one of the Chinese companies that I was looking at actually has an investment division in the US specifically, which I thought was interesting. I personally wouldn't go that route because I get nervous about IP, particularly where you know the space that I'm in. But it just goes to show you that even Chinese companies were setting up kind of US offices to invest in startups here. So I don't know how that one works in particular, but I think there's a lot of opportunity.
I was looking at the report. Hi, my name is Alex. I was looking at the report that you made reference to, because I particularly adore data as much as you do, it seems. One of the questions that popped up.
Wait, let me pause you. Is someone gonna, either he needs to move closer or someone's gonna translate louder, because I'm not, I don't want him to repeat it twice.
Go to the screen, is it closer, better?
Yeah, just go towards the left.
That's perfect. There we go. Great. There we go.
Much better.
Pleasure. My name is Alex. I work in a social enterprise. It's the startup that I currently deal with. I was looking at the breakup of the data of the actual report that you made reference to, because I was fascinated to see what kind of startups were mostly popping up in the environment, as it pertains specifically to the fact that my kind of startup is a social enterprise that in its essence does not seek for to focus on profit. And most of the breaks of the various different demographics that I saw were various different startups are related to SPAD, so using various different cryptocurrencies, so that sort of element, or to address a tech issue in order to deal with the market. In your experience, what has been the environment and the reception from the environment when it pertains to a startup that specifically seeks to address a social issue rather than drive for profit?
So first of all, I wouldn't consider those two things mutually exclusive. Are you saying that, so is that what you're saying, that it's a nonprofit?
It's Yes, it's meant to be a sustainable business that seeks profit for the purposes of its scalability, but not for the purposes of revenue. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a tough one in terms of like what my experience is. So you mentioned a couple of things. I think you mentioned SPACs and cryptocurrency and all that stuff. And so I'll talk about the broad base, and then I'll get specifically to kind of a nonprofit, non-revenue focused, if I understand it correctly. So the investment dollars that I've, just in my experience that I've seen has really flowed to, it's across the board. I think if I had to pick the biggest sector where I see that here in the US, it's healthcare. Healthcare is probably the biggest sector that is getting the preponderance of dollars just because there's so much going on in that space. Following healthcare, certainly, technology and those types of things. I think the non-traditional companies outside of, and again, going back to, as a result of COVID, what we saw is all of a sudden, people weren't investing in like GE stock, but they were investing in things like, if you think about like Tesla, or not Tesla, but Elon Musk's, what is the satellite thing? I can't even think of the name of it that he's
SpaceX. SpaceX.
Yes. No, is it SpaceX? No, the satellite where you can get, like, every person on the planet can get internet access, right? Yes. But so if you think about like companies like that, companies that are focused on like water quality, because all of a sudden we're paying attention to it. Things like the non-meat alternatives and so like those types of things are getting dollars big time, right? So I can't say that I have experience, and I'd have to think about, and I can't think of one offhand, where it's a nonprofit, because nonprofits are usually, they're raising money more through philanthropical efforts than they are through, like a traditional private equity VC type play. But when you say like, it still sounds like what you're describing, like you're not a nonprofit. It sounds like you're just not necessarily, the focus isn't on revenue generation. So I guess my question is that a short-term thing because you're trying to build a user base and traction in the market, or as a whole, your company is more focused on your part of your marketplace, so to speak, is that you're a social good company and you're balancing revenue with other kind of non-tangible financial goals, right?
I'll approach so that you can hear me better.
Yeah.
Yes, it's more of the latter. For context, I work with various different clients that most of them are campaigns at various different stages. So, for example, I'm currently working with an organization that focuses on engaging affordable housing in the wide area of Sydney and Australia. And one of the projects that they're trying to organize, they require my assistance in order to be able to scale it up and provide it as a consultancy service. And another project that I'm working on is tackling the accessibility internet access gap in rural Australia. So the clients that I work with and the problems that I tackle, by its essence, most people have not addressed those issues because there's not enough revenue or profit on those areas. And therefore, the way that I address and engage with those clients and those particular issues are in a more, for the intention of the altruistic element, but for the purposes of ensuring that whatever project and whatever solution I provide, it's a sustainable and scalable solution that does not require me or the actual client that I'm working with to lose profit or lose any income in order to solve it.
Yeah. So That's an interesting one, and it's something that I've, thought about, the because the space where the tech startup that I'm working on has elements of that, which is it is about empowering users. So at its core and at the heart of this thing, it's about empowering users and giving them control in spaces where they've not had control before. So the challenge that you have when you enter a space like that is the money is out there, but it's a matter of finding the right investor. So there aren't a lot of like Bill Gates types out there that are saying, hey, I'm going to invest in clean water and how do we clean up the oceans and whatever it is, all those causes, so to speak. But it sounds like that's the path that you're on. And there's different types of investors. They certainly are out there. There are investors that are saying, hey, I'm out there to do good in the world and I want my money to go towards a specific cause or whatever it is. And they will, they'll approach it with a very different lens than someone, the typical, VC play, which is, hey, what's the valuation? And I'm looking for an exit in, 5 years. Like that's not the route that you're on. So I think it's just it's finding that right kind of investment strategy and investment partner, but they're out there, because you do see companies that are attempting to do, more public good or social good, I think is how you called it, that are gaining traction. And some people will do it, believe it or not, just for, not to trivialize it, but almost the street cred, so to speak, to say like, hey, this is part of who I am. It defines my persona, so to speak. And yes, I'm putting, dollars against this. So I've seen those types of plays as well. And, I haven't been part of those types of, investment plays, but, on the receiving end, I'm like, hey, look, if they're willing to do that, like, who cares? Take the money. So, yeah, so it's harder, but it's certainly doable.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Julie, who is dialed in. My MVP is high cost to a requirement for tooled prototype for manufacturing. Do you know who it will be received for investors without a prototype? It is patent pending. Do you have recommendations on how to seek funding without an MVP for demonstration?
So again, that's another tough one. So just so you know, like in full transparency, I thought I could go down that path myself. It's easier to have something tangible that you can show to an investor. So one way to do it, and I've actually looked at this, is crowdfunding. So I don't know to what extent that's available in Australia. Certainly here in the US, there's a lot of them. So I looked at WeFunder, I looked at Start Engine, are two of the biggest ones. There's a bunch here. So that, so in that case, you basically take your MVP product directly to the consumer, right? And you've got to, I love that approach. You market it, and I'm assuming you guys, crowdfunding works. It's, and that'll be the end consumer will be the ultimate arbiter, so to speak. It does force you, if you're going to do it right, to have some visualization of your product, so to speak. So even if you don't have an MVP, like a physical thing, you can visualize it, because that's the whole purpose of the portal of these crowdfunding websites, is basically they throw up a marketing page for you. And I've seen plenty of products out there that have not had something built. What they've had is either screenshots or, you know, slideware or some kind of video that shows graphically, you know, it could be just an illustration or a storyboard, so to speak. So there are ways to do it via that mechanism. Going to a, you know, a VC private equity type play without and it sounds like it's a physical product, a physical prototype, is going to be tough unless I would say you had, you know, and not knowing what the product is. If you rolled up and said, hey, I have, you know, here's my path to commercialization, so to speak. I have a contract, or I have a memorandum of understanding, or here it is, here's a company that's a potential buyer that's working with me to develop it. Like, those are different strategies that you can use in lieu of a physical product. And I'm actually taking an approach, kind of a hybrid of that. I'm trying to, so I'm building, you know, the actual software MVP. And in my case, I'm also trying to get an actual third-party company to come on board as a co-developer. I would still own the IP, but what that does is when you go, because the goal obviously is, once I can prove that this thing works, you then, you know, the next step is I want funding to be able to scale and refine it, right? And so then you're talking big money. And if I have a partner on board to say, hey, I just did it with this company, they're willing to vouch for me. Now I can say, I can put a value to that. There's an intrinsic value that the investors will immediately understand, which is you probably learned a whole hell of a lot by working with a real world company versus just, you know, in a kind of developer's mindset, so to speak. So there's that you can't even put a cost on or value on. But then the fact that I can now use an actual business model, so to speak, to say, like, here's what it's worth. I can quantify that to this company. Imagine if I can do that for 50 more companies. Now I can show scale and evaluation. So that's how I would think about it if you're not able to get to an actual MVP product.
Julie does have a follow-up. I wanted to maybe unpack there's crowdfunding, right, that you were talking about, but isn't there also investment funding too now as an option, where you can have your organization and allocate shares for that to fund the MVP? They're two separate tracks.
What do you mean?
So from some of the exploratory work that you shared with me, there are certain sites where you have Kickstarter, which is people are giving their cash and then they could get the product in the mail or something, like more like crowdfunding. And then there's investment where you can.
Oh, yeah. So I actually wasn't, so there's two types of crowdfunding. I see your point. So
yeah.
In my prior comments, I actually wasn't talking about a Kickstarter type approach. So, and I guess it depends on the product that you're trying to build. So I was talking about regulation crowdfunding. So that's very different than Kickstarter. So not to diminish the value of Kickstarter, but Kickstarter is kind of like, it's not professional grade, is how I would put it. So here in the US, we have what's called regulation crowdfunding, which is basically equivalent to going to a venture capital fund to raise money, meaning it is regulated by the federal government. There are certain tax implications. So this year, the law just changed. So if I were to go for a regulation crowdfund event, I would be able to raise $5 million in year one, $50 million in year two. So it's that type of scale versus, I'm not familiar with kind of Kickstarter, but it's very different. Kickstarter, anybody can go do it. Regulation crowdfunding, basically, it takes everything that you would do through a traditional VC approach and it democratizes it and says, hey, instead of institutional investors, we're going to open that up to what's referred to as non-accredited investors. So people who make less than, I think it's, 300,000 a year or $1 million in assets, whatever it is. So it means that I can now go out and get funding from anybody. So I can, but it is the same thing as a VC approach. So literally I would be creating a C Corp, I would be issuing shares, convertible notes on equity. So when I go to another round of funding, if you bought in, so let's say you bought $100, you invested $100 in my startup, that would convert into equity shares once I go to raise funds again. So it literally is exactly like VC fundraising, but it's opened up to kind of the general public, so to speak, with lower amounts. I can price something as little as $100 a share. So that's more of what I was referring to versus a Kickstarter type approach.
Perfect, because I think that could answer the how do you manage timeframes to deliver for crowdfunding, because you would be asking in that first round, like to get to MVP, I need X amount of dollars, which isn't probably in the millions, right? It's more into to prove the concept, and that's where you can get the smaller investors.
Yeah, and so that's a great point, because with regulation crowdfunding that I was just describing, you could start off with, you can start off with kind of a campaign to say, I need money to prove this concept. So you can actually get your seed money through regulation crowdfunding. And then from there, what I like about that approach is basically the market will validate immediately whether or not your idea is, whether they like it or not, right? And then
or if they understand it, right? Like,
yeah, and then you've got a
some
built-in
tweaks
audience
of understanding.
You've got a built-in audience that can be advocates for you, depending on what it is that you're trying to do.
All right, that's all the questions that we have online. Are there any other from the group?
Cool. No, we're good. Thank you.
Hopefully it was helpful. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you, yes.
Bye.